Okay, I said we can start, right? So it's a pleasure to introduce this third session of The Shelves, Volume 3, devoted to the new source book, Later Stoicism, 115 BC to 200 AD by Brad Inwood. And just let me mention that the session is recorded and the recording will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, Filosofia Antica Torino, so just so you know it. So this series is organized by our group, Filosofia Antica Torino, with Federico Petrucci and Giulia De Cesaris, in collaboration with Cambridge University Press. And we thank Michael Sharp for being here. And also, I recall that CUP will offer a 40% discount on the book to those attending the session. So a couple of words about the format. I will first invite the author to briefly introduce the book and guide us through it. And next, Vanessa de Harven has kindly accepted to provide a critical examination of the book and of the main issues it raises. And then we will open the floor to the debate also with the participants. So Brad Inwood is William Lamson Professor of Philosophy and Classics at Yale University. He has worked extensively on the schools of Hellenistic and Imperial ages with a focus on Stoicism and Aristotelism. His publications range from physics to ethics to epistemology. Let me just recall some of his books. So Ethics and Human Action in Early Stoicism from 1985, Aristotle's Eudemian Ethics from 2013, and more recently, before the source book, Stoicism, a very short introduction from 2018 for Oxford University Press. So please, Professor Inwood, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for organizing this and for inviting me and my book to come to it. I also want to thank Michael and Cambridge University Press for giving me the chance to undertake this project. I should maybe say a little bit about the nature of the project. This is the third in a wonderful series that the press has initiated. Bob Sharple's tackling later peripatetics, George Boyce Stone's the relevant period in Platonism. And I know I saw Phil Horkey on the screen a minute ago, so we're looking forward to number 4 with Pythagoreanism, but Stoicism is number 3 in the sequence. Saying a little bit about the background to working on the book, it was commissioned in 2011. It took a decade to complete, not just because it was a big job, but because I kept getting distracted. Distracted by editing Oxford Studies for a while, and then I think I lost many months when I moved from Toronto to Yale. And I also undertook the very short introduction to Stoicism, which was actually quite a helpful thing to do to orient myself to think about what was most important in Stoicism throughout. But anyway, the book was drafted by 2020 and revised a year later, and amazingly, the press was able to get published a year after that. So it was a long haul for me, and I was very grateful for the professionalism of the press and their readers who had made a great input. So it really has been a pleasure, and it's a pleasure that I have to say, quite happy to be done with when it was all over. It's nice to look back on it now, some months after publication, to reflect on what the book aimed at and what I think maybe it achieved. One of the main ambitions was to provide fresh translations, up to date, informed by current scholarship of many authors in the later period of the school. It also aimed to include many neglected figures that aren't usually put into the main discussion of the history of Stoicism. And I guess one of the things that I particularly wanted to do and aim to do is to include minor figures, because I find that some of the less famous people really affect the way we look at the characteristics of Stoic philosophy in the later period. So Musonius is not exactly neglected, but his particular take on Stoicism is not usually part of the main narrative. That's even more true for scarcely known people like Attalus, who we noticed a little bit from what Seneca tells us, but he drops out of the narrative typically. I also wanted to integrate with the main story, the main historical outline of later Stoicism, Authors like Hierocles in the 2nd century and Cleomedes, who are often discussed, but not in connection with their place in the historical development. So that was what the main ambition, I suppose. The challenge I found that was particularly hard to work out was how to balance the material from well-preserved authors, Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, but to balance that material, which is typically dominated discussions of the period, with material from fragmentary authors, authors where we only have bits and pieces. I wanted to try to create a kind of a balanced picture of what was actually going on philosophically, but it's very hard to avoid having well-preserved authors dominate the narrative. And so what I was trying to do throughout was to sort of counteract that general tendency, aiming to get a kind of a better rounded out picture of what was going on in the school. And that involves a couple of different things. One thing it involves is pressing to scrounge up all the evidence I could of, say, interest in logic in the later history of the school, which again, typically when we study Stoic logic, we focus on Chrysippus, who did most of the heavy lifting. But there's a great deal of evidence that logic remained a matter of some controversy and interest throughout the history of the school. So I wanted to include as much evidence as I could that bears on that question. Of course, the most important contribution in that area is Jonathan Barnes' book from some years ago, Logic in the Imperial Stoa, which really makes the case for how important logic was for Epictetus. But I think it goes beyond that. And similarly, I wanted to figure out how I could sort of bring out the interest in later Stoics in developments in physics. Because typically the picture we've had of later Stoicism puts a tremendous emphasis on the centrality of ethics and especially applied ethics. And I think that picture is not incorrect. I think it's out of balance. It's out of balance largely because of the accidentals. Maybe it's not accidental. Anyway, the survival of sources. So I confess that the book strains occasionally to bring in material on ethics, on logic and physics, because of an attempt to sort of round things out. Another feature of the book that was central to my planning was to attempt to change the periodization of the way we think about the history of the school. It's been an ambition of mine for many years to eliminate the category of Middle Stoicism, which is a 19th century invention in terms of the periodization of the school, and I think it's a misleading one. And one indication of that, as I just discovered when I looked at the evidence more carefully, is that in the period from, say, Panaetius in the 2nd century BC through to Posidonius, many decades later in the 1st century, while they were doing all of their innovating, there were lots of Stoics who were doing perfectly ordinary Chrysippus-style Stoicism with some small adjustments. So the picture we have had until recently, that there was a sort of a sea change in the way Stoicism worked that came in the sort of Middle Stoic period, I think is actually misleading. Many of the authors who preserve more or less standard views were contemporaries of Posidonius or contemporaries of Panaetius. And I was particularly concerned in the first chapter of the book to try to bring that out, juxtaposing what you might call traditionalists with innovators. The starting point, I had to choose where to begin. What counts as the beginning of later Stoicism? Well, of course, periodizing is always a dodgy thing, but I convinced myself, partly through working on the relations of Stoicism to Peripatetics, that something really major happened in the 2nd century BC, and that Antipater was the character who really marks the beginning of something new. And so I've tried to sort of bring that out. So he was a contemporary of Critolaus, and I think there's evidence of a debate with Critolaus. Of course, he was at odds with Carneades in a major way. And so I think when we start to see significant shifting of focus on some themes, Antipater is the obvious place to start. which is a generation before Panaitius. It was usually thought to be the beginning of something new, as indeed he was. That really is what the first chapter of the book was all about, and what it was aiming to do was to justify the starting point for the later period. To say one advantage I found as I went, I hadn't expected to see this, one advantage of reorganizing the periodization this way is that it enables us to see the significance of some less important figures or less discussed figures. One of whom is the student of Panaitius, Mnesarchus, who is quite important. We know a lot about his metaphysics, as it turns out. And as a student of Panaitius, he, I think, makes some serious innovations in the Stoic metaphysics. He, in my view, what he's trying to do is to sort of relate Stoic corporealism to Aristotelian hylomorphism, is one way of looking at his achievement. And just to sort of show how this source book might differ from previous work. So Mnesarchus appears in Long and Sedley as part of the general narrative of Stoic ontology. And of course, he is important for the general narrative of Stoic ontology, but I think it's fairly clear that Mnesarchus was doing something different from Chrysippus. And so using Mnesarchus as a sort of a point of information for Stoic ontology full stop, which is a project of Long and Sedley to give a sort of a timeless snapshot of the school, I think masked some interesting developments within the school's history. And so my interest has been to sort of try to bring out developments wherever I could. And I think it's characteristic of the ways the school developed that the development was driven by a conversation with other schools. So I think Mnesarchus is responding to peripatetics, as was Antipater responding to academics and peripatetics. And the layout of the book was designed to display this as clearly as possible. It's not exactly a radically new point, but there was no collection of work, no discussion. We sort of made that the focus, and that was the ambition of the book. And the heavy lifting there really is done by the first chapter. Posidonius gets a chapter all of his own, and I have to say, although it was an enormous amount of work to sort through Posidonius, I found myself not having to do a huge amount of conceptual work because Edelstein Kid is such a magnificent achievement, that collection, and I was able to rely on that quite extensively. I present Posidonius as the architect of a second synthesis of Stoic thought. I think Chrysippus is the culmination of the early period of the school and presents a kind of a broad synoptic view of what Stoicism is all about across a wide range of topics. And I think the next Stoic who has anything like that breadth is Posidonius. So I present him as a sort of a somewhat innovative but substantially conservative figure, which I think is a bit of a departure, although it's not that far off what Edelstein can give us. But the idea that he is the author of the second consolidation of the school's doctrine explains a number of things. It explains why he's so often cited alongside Chrysippus in Diogenes Laertius, for example. He was a go-to author for a general view of Stoicism by the time Diogenes was working. It also explains why he comes up so frequently as a reference point for physics and cosmology in the early empire. I don't think there's that much reference directly back to Chrysippus, but Cleomedes, Plutarch, all these people are really looking to the Posidonian consolidation of the school. So he gets a whole chapter by himself, and so does Seneca. Seneca gets chapter 4. So 3 figures get chapters of their own. Seneca gets chapter 4, Epictetus gets chapter 5. Chapter 3 was hard to organize. I wanted to include major developments between Posidonius and Seneca, and that's the late 1st century BC and the most of the 1st century AD, and a lot of quite minor figures, but all of them, I think, significant as part of the story, especially as background to Seneca. If I say if it's a flaw in the organization of the book, it's probably in how I put together chapter 3, because it was just too hard. And some of the chronology was hard to work out, but I did my best. It's a kind of a scattershot picture. Seneca presented a special challenge, especially for me, because I've thought so much about Seneca. He must be the most important guy on the planet, you think. But the real challenge was that there's so much of him, and to try to pare him back so that he wouldn't be overweighing the general picture of the field was difficult. It was also hard to have it be anything but the longest chapter, because Seneca is a diffuse writer. And where with Epictetus, if you want to illustrate him making a certain point, you might need a page. Seneca will take 3 pages to make the point. So there's rather a lot of Seneca. I only have one regret about the Seneca chapter. I realized after the whole thing was done that I really should have said something about the treatise on Providence. So if I'm waiting for reviewers to point out that that was a tragic omission. On the other hand, it's not a treatise that I'm desperately in love with, which is no doubt why I overlooked it. Epictetus, what can I say? The resources for studying Epictetus today are probably better than they've been in 100 years. There's been a lot of good work on him. What this illustrates really well is how hard it is to take an author where we have integral works and divide it up according to logic, physics, and ethics. And here I'll just pause to say that that was part of the plan of the book, was to have each chapter organized under logic, physics, ethics, so that we could see continuity. I wanted the reader to be able to, for example, get to do an historical survey of logic by reading the logic section of chapters 1 through 6, straight through on their own, ignoring the other 2, and the physics section likewise. And that involves, as it were, pulling apart works by Epictetus or Seneca or Marcus to make them fit the categories. And that is, that's a Procrustean kind of artificial thing to do, because as we all know, Stoicism is presented in a mixed format. And so the ancient doxographers, of course, dismantled works for us into logic, physics, and ethics. And I had to do that in order to preserve the kind of comparability that I was trying to build. The last chapter contains more than Marcus Aurelius. It contains important figures who have been the subject of a lot of work, but no one, I think, so far has really done a proper integration. Cleomenes, who's not really necessarily 2nd century AD, but I think an important phase in the history of the school. Cosmologist who tends not to be discussed in context of imperial Stoicism because he does cosmology. But as one discovers reading him at leisure, he's got a very vivid polemical style, which brings out issues of epistemological and ethical interest as well as his cosmology. Hierocles, a very interesting character, again, well studied but not integrated typically into the narrative. Fascinating figure because of his work, very detailed work on as well the metaphysics of psychology in the papyrus remains, and also in straightforward applied ethics or practical ethics in the Eusebius fragments. And I mean, they have been brought together before, but again, not in connection with the network of Stoic ideas in his place and time. Marcus is the largest chunk, I think, of chapter 6. And again, I apologize for the artificiality of carving him up into 3 different fields, but that was part of the plan of the book. He's not the final figure in the book. There is just a little bit of evidence about a Stoic who was working just after Marcus, a man named Aristides, who is in some fragments is portrayed as in debate with Peripatetics. And I think that that's actually, for me, quite symbolically important as a note to end the collection on, to show that to the very end, that the school was engaged in active debate in physics and cosmology with members of other schools. I think it's important to remember that although we think of the Stoicism as this kind of self-contained, systematic presentation of philosophy, in every generation there was debate with other schools, and those debates drove changes. Maybe not fundamental changes, but significant ones. Just a couple of final remarks about the book. It's what I hope will be its user-friendliness. We put a lot of thought into cross-referencing because similar material is found, frankly, all over the place in the book. And I wanted it to be possible for the reader on finding an interesting theme in the Epictetus chapter to find that's anticipated back in chapter 1 or chapter 2 and so forth. So the cross-referencing, I hope, has been successful. I found one typographical error that was totally my fault in the cross-referencing. So I will leave it assiduous readers to find out that. You'll have to read very carefully to find it, but there is a mistake there in the cross-referencing. And the other bit of assistance to the reader that I think I hope will work is in the indices. There's a comprehensive index of sources, a concordance with other major collections. So a concordance which includes references to Von Arno, to Long and Sedley, to Edelstein Kidd, and to the collections of the two major collections of Panaitius. And so hopefully that will help people navigate a little bit. The general index of topics and characters, again, is a pretty standard sort of thing, but again, put together with a thought that you might well want to sort of take a little issue here and tug on it and find that it leads to a variety of connected topics. So if that, we'll find out whether that was done well as the book gets used, but certainly that was the aim, was to enable this kind of rather sprawling 400 and some page book to be accessible and usable as a tool for people beginning to do research in what I hope will be a growing field. So the big picture is, I was determined to think historically about this. I know I spent a good bit of my early career doing Stoicism without qualification, as though it was an undifferentiated mass. I cheerfully assimilated Epictetus to Chrysippus, and I regard that now as a blunder. So in a sense, I'm spent a decade doing, paying penance for that methodological folly of my youth, and I hope that it will be productive for other people to use in the next generation. So thank you again for showing an interest.
Thank you very much for this very rich introduction. I'll introduce now Vanessa de Harven, who is an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts, and her main area of expertise are Stoicism, Stoic physics, and with a specific focus on corporealism. And her interests include epistemology, philosophy of mind, and contemporary metaphysics. I'll mention one of her recent publication, The Metaphysics of Stoic Corporealism. And also she's currently working on a book entitled Everything is Something, the Unity of Stoic Metaphysics. So please, Vanessa, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for asking me to do this. I don't normally read things like this, but I thought in the interest of sharing what I had thought, I would write it up and read it. So I'm going to do that. So I would like to begin just by thanking the organizers for inviting me and saying how much I learned from reading this book. As a scholar who is focused on the early and middle Stoa, if, as Brad points out, that is even something I can say, I benefited tremendously from taking later Stoicism on its own, apart from and yet very much in conversation with earlier Stoicism and the schools around them. I appreciated the well-reasoned decision to mark the end of the Chrysippeian era and the transition to later Stoicism at 155 BC, with the diplomatic mission to Rome by the skeptic Carneades, the Epicurean Critolaus, and the Stoic Diogenes of Babylon. Inwood argues that Carneades was the Stoics' most important critic and that, quote, the school's need to respond to these challenges was a major catalyst for change and development alongside their engagement with Plato and Aristotle. Though we don't know how Diogenes reacted, Antipater clearly, quote, clearly dealt with Carneades' critique extensively, though perhaps not always effectively. Hence, Inwood takes Antipater to be the turning point to later Stoicism. I followed this narrative with great interest. The spectrum on which Inwood locates the views of Antipater and his students from conservative to most adventurous gives depth and nuance to the account of this stage of development. There are elements both of conservatism and of innovation in this period, sort of like a brackish meeting of fresh water and salt water in an estuary. And I especially appreciated that view of things. For example, in chapter 1, we find Antipater conservative about grammar, definition, and apraxia, but engaged in controversy in modal logic by siding with Cleanthes over Chrysippus and denying the first premise of the master argument, and even resisting the orthodox Stoic interest in formalism by championing single premise syllogisms, even if it's true that he remains true to a certain coarse orthodoxy at the same time. Likewise, although Antipater marks a turning point in Stoicism, Inwood finds him conservative in physics compared with Panaetius, who denies the conflagration and destructibility of the cosmos, Boethus, who denies the world as an animal, and Archidemus, who takes the commanding faculty of the cosmos to be at the center of the earth. Even in revising Cleanthes on the etymological treatment of the gods, Antipater is orthodox about the divinity of pneuma and the legitimacy of divination. And with Apollodorus, he's conservative on body as malleable and continuous, offering a clarification rather than a revision of the Stoic commitment to infinite divisibility, as some have understood him. Finally, in ethics, we find a version of Stoicism that departs from Chrysippus, embracing, quote, a kind of parity between basic and practical desires and a natural desire for pursuing truth. But with respect to the status of preferred indifference, Inwood defends Posidonius and Panaetius as upholding the orthodox commitment to the sufficiency of virtue for happiness, denying that external goods are necessary for the good life. Thus, we find a subtle blend of continuity and innovation in this first period, if we can call it that. In chapter 2, Inwood offers a robust defense of Posidonius as an orthodox Stoic, offering a systematic consolidation of physical doctrines, notwithstanding the breadth of vision he brings with his interests in math and science. Against Galen's treatment of Posidonius as a renegade, we find him orthodox about the structure of philosophy, but extending its scope to include grammar and geometry. And in basic cosmology, Inwood argues that Posidonius is clarifying rather than altering the infinity, or indefiniteness, if you prefer, of the extracosmic void, and that he is treated generally as an authority on Stoic physics. Under the heading of metaphysics, Inwood argues that Posidonius again is clarifying orthodoxy when he concedes that surfaces exist both in reality as well as incorporeal conceptions. Rather than departing from the idea that surfaces exist merely in conception, Inwood suggests that Posidonius takes them to exist in reality as a way of distinguishing them from mere fictions without assimilating them to body. I'll return to this point in a minute. With respect to the soul, Inwood finds Posidonius not only orthodox in making the soul's substance be pneuma, but even to claim Plato for his authority, arguing that the Timaeus presents, quote, a more corporeal conception of soul than some Platonists thought, thus showing again, as Antipater and perhaps Panaetius claimed, that Plato lends support to Stoic doctrine, no matter what Plato's followers may have thought about the matter, end quote. And where Galen charges Posidonius with abandoning psychological monism, Inwood in turn charges Galen with polemicizing. Similarly, in pursuit of an orthodox ethics, Inwood rejects the testimony of Diogenes Laertius that Posidonius takes indifference to be goods and that he denies virtue is sufficient for happiness. Here, one wonders on what grounds exactly the evidence of Galen and Diogenes is rejected if it is to be probative of orthodoxy. Small problem, but a problem for all of us. But contrast these more dogmatic moments with the richness of Inwood's arguments with helpful bibliography, that Posidonius remains a cognitivist about the passions, even while suggesting that certain non-cognitive factors can induce irrational beliefs. Posidonius is not abandoning cognitivism, but rather pressing Chrysippus to give a more nuanced account of how the soul falls prey to false views. Here, the book is at its best, connecting early with late Stoa and advancing a sophisticated developmental narrative. For this sustained developmental narrative alone, Inwood's book is essential reference for those using evidence of later Stoics as a window onto the earlier period, or assessing the extent to which we can speak meaningfully of a Stoic orthodoxy. Okay, now something about the format of the book, particularly in contrast to the source books of Long and Sedley and Boeri and Sayez. Sorry, I mistakenly muted myself there for a second. Okay, it's a welcome approach to introduce each text with a brief analysis of the evidence that it provides, alternating between narrative and texts. So we get a little discussion, we get a text or two, we get a little discussion, we get a little text or two. And I appreciated that, the way that it was broken up. Whereas Long and Sedley and Boeri and Sayez present a group of texts grouped thematically and then follow them with a commentary, Inwood opts to make his case in tandem with the texts. This approach is at its strongest in the sustained developmental narrative described above, unfolding a nuanced picture of the transitional period from Antipater to Seneca. Other times, when Inwood is not making his case, the result is more encyclopedic, sort of like a catalog of views attributed to each thinker. Indeed, apart from the developmental narrative, Inwood does not engage in much interpretive controversy. Long and Sedley and Boeri and Sayez often take a position and argue for it, painting the interpretive landscape and giving substantial bibliography for those interested in pursuing the topic at hand. Inwood is less focused on the interpretive landscape and more on presenting the texts as he takes them. Of course, one can only do so much, and this is already an epic undertaking. But it does mean that in some cases, one will have to know already or seek elsewhere the scholarly debates. In other cases, there are perhaps some missed opportunities to keep the developmental narrative going. I'll illustrate the point by reference to the scholarly debates in physics and metaphysics with which I am most familiar, but I suspect the same will be true of Inwood's treatment of ethics as well. This is perhaps something for others to say. One example comes from Posidonius and his treatment of surfaces as existing both as incorporeal conceptions, as Inwood renders katepinoion, and in reality, as he renders kathyupostasin, which I mentioned earlier. So here's an example. It is controversial in the first place to gloss incorporeals as conceptual, particularly as this description risks assimilating the incorporeals to fictions, as Inwood worries, or to impositions on the world by us, as others see it, assimilating them, for example, to lecta, as certain scholars have done. Further, though Inwood does give some important bibliographical references to the literature on limits, we don't find any engagement with Long and Sedley's posit of a tripartite ontology, which includes bodies, incorporeals, and a third category of what is neither corporeal nor incorporeal to cover fictions and limits, like surface. Nor is there any mention of the nearly universal posit of a third class of entities called not somethings, utina, between something and nothing, which is typically taken to include limits, fictions, and concepts. If one knows of these debates, Inwood's commentary says much more than appears to the untrained eye. Another example comes from the analysis of parts of Seneca's Epistle 58. Inwood sees Seneca in 58, 26 to 29 as addressing basic metaphysical issues with, quote, Stoic doctrine cast in somewhat Platonist terms, embracing the feebleness of the material cosmos and its reliance on the demiurge, as in the Timaeus. But the most salient metaphysical issue in Epistle 58, many would argue, is the rejection of something as the highest ontological genus, and the report that some Stoics include centaurs and giants among what there is. This report is intended to show that the genus something is odios. Since Seneca has already accounted for bodies and incorporeals, or what is bodily and non-bodily, as Inwood puts it, under the genus, or principle, as Inwood puts it, being, the only remaining job for the genus something is to accommodate things that plainly are not real. Therefore, we should do away with something as the highest genus. Inwood does give us this passage with some important bibliographical references, but no mention is made of the issues concerning the status of fictions, whether as neither corporeal nor incorporeal, or as not somethings, or whether the genus something was original or developed later or evolving over the later period, all of which would speak to Inwood's developmental narrative. Perhaps another way to put the point is that Inwood lets the organization of the book do the talking. This brings me to the second point about the format of the book. In an effort to redress the, quote, picture of later Stoicism that tends to overestimate the place of ethics and play down engagement with logic, physics, metaphysics, and epistemology, Inwood aims for an arrangement that is as close to uniform as possible. Even the selections of Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus are presented under the headings of logic, physics, and ethics in order to, quote, extract from their differently organized works the contributions they made to these standard divisions of philosophy. This runs the risk of misrepresenting these thinkers by cutting up their works into artificial, even Procrustean categories, end quote. I'm a huge fan of this strategy to connect later with earlier Stoics. In fact, my main question is, why not be more Procrustean? Not only do the subdivisions of each part of philosophy, logic, physics, ethics, vary across the chapters, the titles of the parts themselves vary. For example, logic, logic and dialectic, logic, dialectic and method, logic and grammar, logic and method, or physics, physics, cosmology and theology, physics and theology, physics and cosmology. I'll spare you a recitation of all the various subtitles and how they differ. But the point is that I was curious how it would have been to be even stricter about the Procrustean arrangement as a way of highlighting their differences as much as their similarities. One might take that to be the point of varying the headings to emphasize that they do differ in these ways. But then one wonders whether the traditional picture, according to which it's all ethics after Seneca, has not been supported rather than undermined. Is there really more physics going on than they have been given credit for? The Procrustean approach in chapter 3, which covers lesser known Stoics from Posidonius to Seneca, suggests that there was in fact more logic and physics than ethics going on with Chaeremon and Cornutus, while Musonius Rufus was active in all three, but especially in logic and ethics. So far, so good. But with Seneca, Epictetus, and the 2nd century Stoics, this is chapters 4, 5, and 6, things are not so clear. The narrative concerning logic shows a clear trend away from logic for its own sake toward the defensive and practical use of logic as a dialectical tool. In fact, this trend might have found its seed in Antipater's resistance to unnecessary formalism in chapter 1. That would have been a nice connection to make explicit. The topic of metaphysics, on the other hand, all but disappears from the Procrustean formula, appearing only for Cornutus and now as a part of logic rather than ethics. If this absence is meant to signal that the late Stoics were less engaged in metaphysics, that would be interesting, but it would also suggest that the traditional picture has merit. As to the topic of physics, here things are still less clear. The heading consistently appears, and many of the topics are correctly classed as physics. For example, for Seneca, the active and passive principles, meteorology, earthquakes, optical phenomena, thunder and lightning, et cetera, even gifts of nature owed to the gods. But I wonder, do these count as contributions to physics, advancing the cause, or are they just an indication that the Stoics sort of engaged with the material? And does Epistle 58 dividing being into bodies and incorporeals really count as physics? As for Epictetus, while there is some material that is clearly a part of physics, for example, the conflagration and sympatheia, it is not clear that Stoic cosmopolitanism, even though based on physics, is really a physical theory. Nor is their commitment to the telos being to follow God a physical thesis on the grounds that God is nature. Likewise, the topics of death and exile, acceptance of one's lot in life, or teleology and gratitude. And in the 2nd century too, much of what is included as physics may be better described as ethics. For example, Hierocles on the topics of punishment and the goodness of God. Cleomenes, on the other hand, who is legitimately contributing to physics, is cataloged for his views on the void, zones of the cosmos, sympatheia, and the celestial bodies. But debates over the nature of extracosmic void that connect with the early Stoics are left to the side, neglecting the developmental narrative with which we began. And with Marcus, much of what appears under physics is not clearly physics. For example, the relation of part, you, to whole, your destiny, cosmopolitanism, the nature of the human being, limitedness, even cosmic unity and flux as ethical lessons, not to mention providence as an account of how virtue is up to us, rationality, the God within, and the cosmopolis. It's not that we can't see how these topics presuppose a certain physics, but that classing them as topics in physics is a bit of a stretch, particularly in comparison to the first later Stoics that we started with. Here, a more Procrustean approach would lay bare just how far the Stoics were really contributing to logic, physics, and metaphysics, as opposed to simply taking the views of their predecessors as background or just gesturing at it. Indeed, in the later Ethics, Inwood calls out the Stoic rejection of needless physics to achieve the goal in life. So one wonders again whether the orthodox picture of the later Stoics is not borne out after all. On the other hand, there is physics to be had, not just Marcus contributing, but Marcus innovating or maybe even going rogue in Stoic physics. Inwood discusses for ethical purposes the causal autonomy of the mind for Marcus, and the idea that for him, human beings are a body, a soul, and a mind, this latter thing really being the person. But he bypasses the juicy physics of this thesis. David Sedley, in an article titled Marcus Aurelius on Physics that Inwood cites, argues that Marcus is innovating by treating both the body and the soul as merely material stuff, stripping pneuma of its divine status and powers, and identifying intelligence or the mind as a third immaterial thing able to resist the flux of matter, i.e. body and soul in this category now of material, merely material. The implications of this view for Stoic physics are significant. First, pneuma can no longer be the divine immanent creator of the world. And second, insofar as they posit something immaterial and intelligent in addition to pneuma and matter, which can resist their material flux, the Stoics are no longer corporealists. These are both arguably disqualifying commitments. So the possibility that Marcus is innovating in this way begs for the developmental narrative with which Inwood begins. Is Stoicism evolving, or is Marcus no longer a Stoic? Or is this another reminder, as Sedley puts it, that, quote, technical school orthodoxy is not of paramount importance to him? Perhaps Marcus is simply indifferent to physics on ethical grounds, embracing n'importe quoi. Atoms are gods, who cares? Because either way, our insignificance is at the fore. Okay, in conclusion, I find myself wishing for an epilogue. And when I got to the end, what I really, really wanted was an epilogue that returned, a short one, that returns to the way in which Antipater marks a turning point for later Stoicism, how exactly Posidonius was systematically consolidating Stoic physics, a reassessment of the extent to which Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus were or were not all about the ethics, and most of all, a return to the developmental narrative with which we began. This is simply to say that one always wants more of a good thing. And having heard what Brad was saying earlier, I would add to my list here a little bit more about Nicarchus, and the engagement with hylomorphism. That I would also love to hear more about. Okay, last thing. I would be remiss if I did not add that a review of the concordance shows just how much this resource is needed. There's little overlap with Long and Sedley, only some with SVF3, and the rest is gathered from the editions of individual Stoics. Inwood has done a great service to the profession in gathering these resources in one place. And let us not forget the wealth of fresh translations. Inwood's choices in translation are always informed and informative, reasoned and reasonable. Agree or disagree with these choices, no research will be complete that does not take them into account. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these stimulating comments. I shall first invite Brad Inwood to reply if you wish, and then we can open the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Vanessa. That was really, you spent some time with this, and it's wonderful how carefully you've read. And actually, some of the things you pointed out were very much features of the design of the book. The focus on the historical arc is something which I committed to early on. And you're quite right to say that there's lots of philosophical detail that I let go into the background. There just wasn't space to do it all, and I privileged the historical narrative. What I hope to have done is to provide a framework within which people will do exactly what you've done. And I think it's non-accidental that the first chapter has a more developed version of the historical story, because that's the one that establishes the pattern. I'm hoping that it's implicit throughout, and I think you kind of brought out some of the places where some additional development really would be a good idea. And as for the point about being more Procrustean, I get it. It really would make some things clearer, but in defense of being just a little less Procrustean, I'd say, first of all, I really was pretty Procrustean, as it was. Squeezing some of that stuff into physics for Marcus Aurelius takes, really is putting the text on the rack. And so I would say that's, having decided to do it that way, it was bound to be some strain around the edges. But I agree with all of your observations about where it's a bit of a stretch. One just last thought, though. You observe that, especially with physics and logic, some of the later people weren't innovating, and none of the evidence shows that they were innovating. And I have to say, I wasn't actually terrifically interested in whether or not a given later Stoic was innovating. What I wanted to show is that they were interested and engaged with the issues in logic and in physics. And yes, a lot of it was conservative. But in contrast to the more traditional picture, that later Stoics only cared about ethics, as though they were all like Aristotle of Chios. That's what I was trying to sort of push back against. So even if Hierocles' account of the soul is just what Chrysippus said, the fact that it was worth writing a book of that size to reassert it is really what I wanted to illustrate. But yeah, many of them were either just repeating the earlier material of the school or developing it in very minor ways. But again, what the point is to show that they actually were engaged. And I think the evidence does bear that out. Anyway, thank you very much again. They're wonderful comments. Take them to heart.
Thank you very much. Are there, I don't know if Vanessa de Harven wants to say something more, or we can open also the floor to the discussion, and if there are some questions.
If people have questions, I'm happy to cede the floor. Maybe I say one little thing about the Procrustean thing. I think I had visions of like of the physics section being just straight up empty or something like that, and that would be this dramatic way of making the point.
Right, I get it.
Jeff Barno, please. No, we cannot hear.
Yeah,
okay.
I know. Thank you. Very interesting talk and commentary. I really enjoyed it. I'm sort of retired from Stoicism, but I did write a book about, but at least I thought the book was mainly about Stoic logic. It was called Propositional Perception. And some of you may know it, I hope. It was never reviewed. I had to force the Bryn Mawr review to even take it. I don't know what happened, but at least 4 of the 6 chapters are concentrating on Stoic logic. One question I had, you didn't mention Cicero at all. And I found Cicero had passages that were really helpful in making sense of Chrysippus. More than a few. So I was just curious, does Cicero count? Does he figure?
Good. So you put your finger on a really delicate point methodologically for me. Cicero is present through much of that first chapter. So he is an important source, but he's a I found it very difficult to sort of know just what to do. For example, with book 3 of De Finibus. Is that going to be, as it were, later Stoicism, or not? In fact, I didn't treat it that way because, and it isn't fully discussed, but it looks very much to me as though what Cicero gives us in De Finibus 3 draws heavily on Diogenes just before the period of change. So although in date, Cicero, when he's talking about the mainstream account of Stoic ethics in Fin 3, I don't treat him as a source for later Stoicism, but in other works, I think he is very much a source. So in the discussions of epistemology, he is. So I had endless judgment calls to make about how to handle Cicero. And if I were going to be indulging in self-criticism here, I would say that that's something which I should have discussed in the introduction, just how difficult it was to sort of balance the handling of Cicero. And I did, sweat it when I was writing it, but I didn't explain it. That probably would have been helpful to do.
Would it be enough to call him an eclectic and then not worry about his orthodoxy about a whole view?
Well, Cicero's own views, he's an academic. He's an unapologetic academic beginning to end. So in the sense, his views are not, part of my remit. However, in some areas, for example, in some works, especially the De Officiis, where he's speaking in his own voice, he says a lot of important things about, say, Panaetius ethics and Hecato and so forth. So he becomes an important character there. So again, it's a very mixed bag with Cicero. But yeah, good question.
Looking forward to the book.
Thank you.
Filarki, you have a question?
Hi, Brad. Thanks very much for your wonderful book. I've got a question about the end of your book. I'm struggling right now with why I've arbitrarily chosen to end my book around AD 200. And it's something that I went through and read yours and George's and Bob's books, and only Bob addressed directly why he finished, or at least that I could find, why he finished around AD 200. Right. And I was wondering if you might comment on that. I mean, at some point, I think at the very end of chapter 6, you talk about this figure I've never heard of, Aurelius Heraclides, and then you sort of say he occupied the chair after Marcus, and then there's like silence after that. And I wonder if you might say something about why you ended there and what could go on afterwards, because I just don't know.
Good. That's a really, really exciting question, because when you look at the evidence for ancient Stoicism, things change quite dramatically when you get to about 200 AD. They really do. With the Severan dynasty, the imperial family supporting Plotinus in his own little research center, and the gelling of later Platonism into Neoplatonism. Clearly, there was a major shift in the way schools related one to another at that point. When you look at the evidence for Stoic thinkers, it just stops about them. Normally, people have said that the last Stoic was Marcus Aurelius. I included Aurelius Heraclides just because it shows that Marcus wasn't the last. But the plain fact is, there's virtually nothing after. Afterwards, you get what you get is reception history. which I decided that I would not deal with. I decided not to deal with broader influence on literature and not to try to deal with reception history, which would have taken us down through centuries. So it is this brute historical fact that Stoicism seems to run out of steam intellectually about the time of Alexander and Plotinus, who are interacting with each other. I have it in mind that someday I will try and solve that and publish the results, but I think it's just the fact of the sources. I had to guess, I would, what the story is that the arguments for the Stoic theory failed in the face of the critique from the Peripatetics and especially from the Platonists. Why they failed is a job not for a historical source book, but for a monograph on the history of the school. And it would be nice if I lived long enough to do that, because I think that's a critically important question in terms of finishing the story of the historical arc. So doing this book meant that I didn't have to tell the story at the beginning, and I also don't tell the story at the end. I just take this slice in the middle. So it is unfinished work. You're quite right. I wish I could give you a straight answer, but I can't.
So before to leave the word to Giulia De Cesaris, let me just say that as Michael Sharp has written in the chat, so if you want to get a discount on this book, you should email him, and he has put his email address in the chat. And please, Giulia De Cesaris.
Yeah, I have something which is probably a very naive question, but we have been speaking about orthodox or conservative or more adventurous Stoics. So when comparing like the later tradition to the early one, and of course, when we're using this label of later Stoicism, we're clearly imposing like a big label on different people who have different agendas and so on. But I was wondering if there is anything like, are there any more unitary criteria that make a later Stoic, or is there something that they share, or like common traits, strong common traits that help us identify like the later tradition?
No, I don't think there is. I think there is a unity of development, but I think there's so much variety.
So we should just treat it as a historical like label.
Yeah, I think it is an historical label, and I do, as Vanessa pointed out, I do try hard to sort of justify starting where I start. I think there's a reason to say that there was a sort of a shifting of the ground. And I think it's really clearly represented by a move that Antipater makes. Antipater writes a book with all we know is the title. And the title is that according to Plato, only the Kalon is good, which is of course a Stoic doctrine. And so his book was arguing that Plato actually agrees with the Stoics. This is I think a counter-Platonist move. And I think Posidonius does the same thing with his theory of the physicality of the soul in terms of reinterpreting the Timaeus. So I think what starts the later development is this kind of renewed engagement with Platonism and Aristotelianism. But then it goes where it goes. It's a widespread movement. People do all kinds of strange things. And so the label's meant to be merely indicating that it comes after that point in time.
Thank you.
Vanessa de Harven. No, you're muted.
I think I was just going to say that one way to maybe approach that question is basically what Brad just did, which is to maybe try and say more about how Antipater marks a turning point and what turning point that is. And then also some of the ways in which we might think of Posidonius as having consolidated. So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I could say that there is something which I think does unify parts of the later school, and that's this looking back to Posidonius. And I mean, I would argue as an historical thesis that there were two major consolidations: Chrysippan consolidation and then the Posidonian consolidation, and that in the imperial period, people look back primarily certainly in physics and cosmology to Posidonius, and that's something they share. I mean, all kinds of people. I think Plutarch is often talking about the Posidonius version of things, but that's only in one area.
Thank you again.
Are there other questions?
May I just, well, this is a question and a remark on this last topic. I mean, well, first, the question. In the volume, you mentioned twice probably Antiochus.
Mm-hmm.
And that's interesting from my point of view, just because as you know better than me, there are Charles Britton or George Boy Stones that probably, if they had to write a book on later Stoicism, they would have included Antiochus in the volume as a Stoic, probably. While, I mean, I remember your paper in the David Sedley's Antiochus volume, and you were against overall this reading, if I have it right, and of course it's reflected in your treatment. And the question would be, then, if we agree that Antiochus is on the Platonist side, to say, in that case, it would react exactly to this attempt of appropriation of Plato by the Stoics,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, paradoxically enough, the comeback of Platonism depends on the fact that the Stoics tried to appropriate, at least in part, depends on the fact that the Stoics wanted to appropriate Plato, right?
Right. No, so why is Antiochus not there? Well, simple answer is he's not a Stoic. But on the other hand, you're going to come back and say, but you show an interest in the dynamic relationships between schools, and so why doesn't he come in there? I would say that the reason is, as far as I can tell, the flow of ideas is from Stoicism to Antiochus, not the other way. I can't identify anything that Antiochus innovates on, which then has impact on Stoicism. Whereas Antiochus is clearly, very significantly affected by Stoicism. So it was, in a sense, a one-way street of influence. Whereas in the case of Marcus Aurelius, I think you can see a lot of influence from Platonism in him, and I try to bring that out. Certainly with the beginnings of the period, Carneades beating up an Antipater, I think, has a huge impact on the direction of the school. So where there's influence on Stoicism from other schools or from their interchange, I do try to bring that out. But Antiochus, I think, is really on the receiving end, not the giving end when it comes to ideas. And a fuller story of interaction with other schools would certainly include him in a major way. But I was pushing my luck with the press on the length of the book as it is.
Thank you so much.
If there are no other questions, I have a question myself. And it was just about I would say, the relationship between physics and theology, because in some chapters, I mean, you highlighted that there is a strong relationship between physics and theology. Is this something that is somehow new with respect to Chrysippus? Or I mean, at least it is explored in a different way. I mean, we know that it's still there in Chrysippus, but it is explored in a different way. And also this strange link with mythology. So Cornutus, who comments so much. And so
Good. Well, Cornutus on the sort of the allegorical account of the gods is it's clearly part of an exposition of physics, is really pretty bizarre, except when you look back to Antipater, you see that Antipater himself has etymological accounts of the gods, which are supposedly significant for physics. So it's not something which emerges, out of the fevered brain of a crazy first century AD Stoic. It was actually somehow part of the school straight through. I think bringing theology under physics was just a response to the standard layout of topics that we read in Dodge's Laertius. That's how that gets organized. And it's clear that Chrysippus put theology under physics. And just, I mean, just a related point, that Vanessa's comments brought up, yeah, metaphysics is also under physics by and large. Some of it might be under logic to some extent. It's hard to know where to put it. Things that we regard as metaphysics really are a distinct set of issues in Stoicism, but the standard tripartite division doesn't have a subheading for metaphysics, which is kind of irritating. And I've worried about that as long as I've thought about Stoicism, because it's not as though, see, I think theology falls nicely under physics and cosmology. I don't find that a strain at all, because they were just corporealists. But a lot of the themes that Vanessa and I would both treat as metaphysical themes don't involve bodies, and yet there's Stoic theory on them. It's very hard to see the proper way to present them. And so I think everyone struggles with that. I'm not sure that I got it right. When in the Cambridge Companion to the Stoics, which I edited ages ago, I asked Jacques Brunsvig to write a chapter on Stoic metaphysics. And Brunsvig begins by explaining how tricky it is to even conceptualize it. So I don't think with metaphysics there's an easy answer, but with theology, I'm just going to say, yeah, I think it's part of physics. Chrysippus's view, Posidonius's view, no reason to waver on that.
Thank you. Malcolm Lowe?
Oh, yes, I've written a note in the chat, and I took care to formulate it in a very cautious and careful way. So I think the easiest thing would be if you would simply read out the note.
Let me go back. There it is. Okay, so Malcolm wrote, since the Stoics inherited from the Cynics the conception of ethics as conformity to genuine human nature, in Stoicism, ethics and physics are in some sense two sides of one coin, certainly more so than in other major schools. So there is a possibility for developments in ethics to imply developments in physics, at least in a secondary manner. And this may explain why Brad's effort to extract developments in physics from texts that emphasize ethics may seem artificial, yet be worth consideration. Thank you. I think this is part of the fusion of themes that, this is the famous mixte paradisus in Dodge's Laertius that some of us here kind of, Julianus has written about this, Chris Gill's got a view on it, I've got a different view on it. What to do with that way of carving up physics and then talking about the way the different parts of philosophy relate to one another is an interesting and really contentious area. But you've captured well, and thank you, for the motivation. It's because, in my view, ethics has a particular relationship to physics. I think physics in two different ways that they do get blurred together. And this would be part of my defense for some of the things that I smuggle into physics in Marcus Aurelius. I think Vanessa's quite right. Some of the stuff just shows that he knows physics, but he wants to use it for moral purposes. And why should I count that as physics? Well, because I wanted to have a section on physics. You could just as easily put it under ethics. I quite agree with that. And that's part of the sort of the blended version of this. So it's tempting then to say, well, why not just get rid of this tripartition into logic, physics, and ethics if the communication of it is so blurred? Well, one of the reasons for not doing that is, in the history of the school, that some Stoics rejected some branches of philosophy. Aristo of Chios, who was as Stoic as anybody, first-generation student of Zeno's, just like Cleanthes, looked at the tripartition and said, I want to get rid of logic. I want to get rid of physics. They make no contribution. So there's someone who's thinking about the structure of the school's ideas in terms of the tripartition. So just ignoring the tripartition would kind of, ignore that important issue. You could say the same thing about Seneca's normally dismissive attitude to many parts of logic, not all of it, but to many parts of dialectic. I think he's thinking in terms of the tripartition, thinking of you. So we can't really get rid of the tripartition, but the boundaries between the parts are contentious. So thank you for the observation. It's, I don't find this an easy area to navigate.
If there are no other questions, I would like to thank again our speakers for today, Brad Inwood and Vanessa de Harven. The discussion was very rich and stimulating. And also I'll present next week's session. Yeah, we will have with us David Ibri, and we will present his book on Plato's Phaedo, Forms, Death, and the Philosophical Life, discussed by Susanne Opdolek and Federico Petrucci. So we hope to see you there again. And yeah, thank you very much for attending and to the speakers again.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.